with Damra Spotwick, who is listening in, who's part of the Friends of Chatham Library. And we planned it, so long ago. And it was really not because we wanted to have it this spring, but because we couldn't find a date that the library didn't have another talk and I was free. So it's actually turning out very well, because I started my book tour in June at the Chatham bookstore. And this is actually my last scheduled event that's really part of the tour. So it's sort of fun that it's here at the Chatham Library. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a psychologist, and I'm actually a retired psychologist. I live in New Lebanon, New York. I formerly of Manhattan and New Lebanon, and formerly of many other places. But I have 4 sons who live in Phoenix, LA, Boston, and DC, and 5 grandchildren who are in the Boston and DC households. This talk is going to be a little different than some. And I should say that we're recording it. I hope that's okay with everyone. It's fun for me to be able to post talks and interviews on my website, and Julie's actually going to post it on the Chatham website. So if you think it was great, you can refer your friends to it. And the other thing, in the chat, I put information about buying the book. You can buy it at all the usual places. But I actually, because I thought I'd be giving talks and selling my books at talks, I have quite a few. I'd be happy for you to email me and I can send it to you at a discount. I know exactly what it costs. I can just stick it in an envelope. So go to my website, or it's adeliamoore@gmail.com. And the website is adeliamoore.com. So what I'm going to do that's different is reflect more on how the book came to be. Most of the talks, because the content of the book, about parenthood, being the grown-up, is something everyone wants to ask me questions about, sort of clinical questions. That's what I've mostly done as a talk. But I was feeling more reflective as I thought about this and this sort of year of promoting the book, and I thought I would start with that instead. So I'm going to talk mostly about the writing of it, a little bit about the promoting of it, which will inevitably, when I talk about the writing, talk about the content. Then I'll read, sort of, rather than reading first and talking later, I'm going to read a couple of passages at the end. And then I hope you'll ask me questions. When Julie and I talked about this, I said, should I make it focused on the pandemic? And she said, I think everybody's going to be kind of pandemiced out. And that was fine with me, because I've done 4 or 5 talks now on parenting in the pandemic, and I'm pandemiced out. I'm not out of talking about being a parent and the challenges, but so feel free to ask me questions focused on that as a grandparent or parent or teacher, or whatever you might be. So this book, as probably most books, grew out of my experience. Obviously out of my experience as a parent, student of child development, and a psychologist, but also, and Marion will appreciate this as one of my younger sisters, out of my experience growing up in a big family. Because I was third, and I was very much oriented towards doing things with my siblings, not necessarily having to be the authority. It was more, as many of you know, and you can see a quilt on the wall in the back.
Well, she's talking away, but I can't get any sound yet.
Uh-oh, she's talking away and someone can't get sound. Who's that?
Yeah, nothing. It's not like you can't,
Who's having trouble with the sound?
Watching.
Someone's having trouble with sound. That must be Gregory. Oh, well, okay. I hope he can come back. So all of that sort of goes into the content side, but I also, my entire life wanted to write, and in fact did write journals, letters. I would have ideas for articles. I would have outlines for books, and I came across a couple of these, including one about moving when I was cleaning up to move here. I would have bursts of attempts to get published, but didn't really ever sort of find my groove as a writer. And I had that unusual experience when I was about 20. My godmother lived in Windsor, Vermont, not too far from the Northshire Books in Manchester, if those who are local know that store. And she had a post office box next to the post office box of J.D. Salinger, and they were friendly. And on one time when I was visiting, he came over for tea. I think I met him twice, but on this one momentous visit, we were standing around, I think when he was getting ready to go, and this is my memory anyway, and either he asked me what I wanted to do with my life, or I volunteered that I wanted to be a
well, it
writer.
didn't offer me that.
I volunteered that I wanted to be a writer. And he said, I think I was about 20, he said, well, if you haven't published by the time you're 21, you might as well forget about it. Which was not exactly your model of, the nice writer wants to mentor the young person. And I hope that's not, what inhibited me. I don't think so. My most recent effort besides the book is also based on meeting someone famous, which was an experience with Mr. Rogers. I lived in Pittsburgh, and on my website you can, all you have to do is Google Mr. Rogers, Adelia Moore, and it'll come up. You do have to pay a little bit for it. But the reason I mention that is because the piece that I wrote when Mr. Rogers was getting all this attention because of the documentary and the film, was when I remembered the experience that I had with him. What seemed most important was the attention that he was able to pay to me as we were interacting, as well as when I watched it later, to that child on the other side of the screen. And it's sort of a nice crystallization of really what it means to be a grown-up, even though my subtitle is about natural authority, and I'll talk more about it. The way I think about authority is not a matter simply of discipline and limits. It's also a matter of the kind of connection and presence that grown-ups provide for kids. And Mr. Rogers is a perfect example of that. But getting back to the book. So my youngest son, Rowan, who himself is a writer now, one day on a subway ride in New York when he was in college said, "Mom, how come you never wrote a book?" And I told him a lot of what I just told you. I always wanted to write. I tried, and this and that. And then he said a great thing, which no mother could resist, was, "Well, you did a good job with us. Why don't you write about that?" So I actually found a course on writing in the field at a place called the Ackerman Family Institute with a wonderful writer named, oh gosh, what's her name? I can't remember her first name, Evan Imber Black, who writes about families, and started a sort of generic parenting book. It took me 8 years to go from that to the book that I ended up with. 4 of those years were reading and developing ideas. And it wasn't really until 2010 that I started what became, so 4 years into it, that I started the book that became this book. And that, I'll talk about how that happened a little bit later. One of the surprising things that I found myself doing during the pandemic is a 1,000-piece puzzle, which was mostly because I saw my son doing one. I thought, oh, maybe if he can do a puzzle, maybe I can do a puzzle. And I realized doing it that it suits me because, like a quilt and really like writing, it's a matter of finding the right piece to go in the right place. And that's why writing takes so long. But I love the writing part. It was not easy always, but I joined a writing studio near us in New York, where for $150 a month, I could go and sit in a little cubby hole and a lot of other writers around me and get a cup of tea. So it was actually a whole different kettle of fish when I got to having to get the book published. I'm not going to tell that story. That has some highs and some very lows, many, many rejections. The short version is many, many rejections. And then I ultimately decided to self-publish. I'm happy to say something about that if anyone wants to hear more about it. And then the even harder part, promoting your book. I'm also not going to talk too much about that. I've enjoyed the talks when I've actually gotten to them, like right now. This is fun, seeing faces and, when you all ask questions. But it's quite grueling to make the context, to make the plan, to do the prep. I had a publicist for a while. People do buy books, people do read, but getting your book in front of them, especially if you're self-published, is a challenge. So the more you can help me by sharing, that's great. And do check out my website where there are links to various things that I've done. So I'll pivot now to the ideas of the book. So I told you that I started with this course and this sort of generic parenting book, and I had given talks before. But I started meeting with a friend, her name is Nancy Heckinger, and she and I had known each other 25 years before in California, ended up both in New York, shared that we both wanted to be writers and had never really succeeded, and we started meeting. And what came out of those conversations for me was the realization that what I wanted to write about was not the what, not strategies, not techniques, but really the how. That in moments between parents and children, as in moments between any of us, a lot is going on, and it has to do with your body and your voice and your eyes and your presence. And it took a long, I remember at one point we had a conversation, I said, maybe it's the mode of how you speak. And that wasn't quite right. Well, ultimately I came up with this phrase, natural authority. And during that time, I shared a chapter that I'd written about technology with a writing group that I was briefly in. And a couple of people in books and the group said, this isn't about technology, this is about authority. And when I shared the entire draft with a friend, Nan Newell, who lives in Pittsburgh, who's an editor for a self-publishing company, and when we talked about it, she said, you know, your book is really about authority. And the book that she was looking at didn't explicitly have that as its theme. But that, finally I realized that was what I was getting at was, and you know, you're supposed to have an elevator speech when you write a book. I've had a heck of a time with the elevator speech because it's hard to describe what I'm talking about. It took a whole book to do it. And of course, that's always true for people. But basically, I'm talking about what happens between parents and children and how understanding that from lots of different angles and sort of harnessing the reality that as the grown-up, you have responsibility for your children and they are dependent on you for a good long time and very dependent when they're little, means that they really do want to look to you and they really do want your approval and want to do what you say. And I know it's not that easy in the actual moment. So my big realization was that authority is communicated through the relationship, not through strategies. Strategies are important, some are better than others, but no matter what strategy you use, if you don't feel confident, if you don't believe that you're the grown-up and that ultimately you're in charge of expectations, limits, and so forth, then your strategies are much less likely to work. And another, and I'm not going to talk about this, but I do talk a lot about it in the book, is if there are two parents involved, whether they're living together or apart, it makes a huge difference whether they have come to some agreements about the way they are going to interact with the kids and what the strategies are, because it's very easy to undermine the authority of the other parent. So my effort then was to try to deconstruct not so much the whole relationship, but these moments. And as I wrote, I noticed that the parenting culture really had changed around me, or maybe I just hadn't noticed. And I thought that the people who were coming to me for help were coming because there were clinical issues about their lack of confidence. But I really started to realize that there was a different approach to being a parent, and it made taking on authority rather difficult. A very good book about that is by someone named Alison Gopnik, who's actually out there in Berkeley where Wendell is. She's a cognitive developmental psychologist, and her book is called The Gardener and the Carpenter. And she's talking about the difference as a parent in whether you're trying to construct something, you know, a product, you want your child to turn out a certain way, or whether you're providing the kind of context and environment that will allow your child to grow into who they sort of mean to be. And it doesn't mean that you don't need to do a little pruning and fertilizing and different things along the way. It's a wonderful little book. So let me talk a little bit about the influences, because what happened as I started to write the book, it wasn't so much that I was going to research discipline and authority. It was more that I was reflecting on my own experience as a sibling, as a parent, as a grandparent, as a psychologist, and the experience of the parents I knew, and the experience of my sisters and brothers with their children, and ultimately with my children and their children, and started to think about the sources that had had such an impact on me as I got a master's in child development and ultimately a PhD in clinical psychology. So primary among those influences, or one of the most basic, was John Bowlby and the theory of attachment. And attachment is all the rage now in the parenting world. And a lot of people think it means you have to have your child on your hip all the time or sleep with them or whatever. And I'm talking about something really more something that happens without you trying to make it happen, which is that your child, like a baby duck, dependent on its mother, is attached to you. And it's much more complicated for us than it is for ducks. But nevertheless, you are what I call the big object. So who are the two people, the big object and the little object? And here's where no psychological sources, as much as other things I've read in my life, literature. I majored in English. One of my favorites is Virginia Woolf, another George Eliot, and more current favorite is Marilyn Robinson. And I think they had a lot to do with helping me understand and realize that what was so important to me, and what I think is so important for parents to appreciate, is that each of us, parent and child, is a person in the world with our own experience, our own inner life, our own reflections and fears. And much of it gets unsaid. And, Virginia Woolf is so great. If you remember the dinner party at To the Lighthouse, when everyone's sitting there and they're thinking something and then the conversation is about something entirely different. So the chapter that reflects that is called Who Are You? But then, who are you is also very influenced by your biological profile. What I call, the chapter is particular selves. Temperament is the biggest influence, but also birth order, gender. And the person who influenced me very much in that is named T. Barry Brazelton. You might have known the book Infants and Mothers, and he's had other books about the great impact of temperament. And this was very helpful for me as a mom, because even though I'd had a lot of experience with siblings, I didn't have any friends with babies at the time and no siblings with babies. And I had a very sensitive child, and we had to learn how to get along with each other. Then there were Salvador Minuchin and Murray Bowen, who are the two giants in the field of family therapy. And this is so important, and I'm sure it feels more important to me because I come from a big family. It's hard to ignore the influence of family when you come from so many, but it's true for all of us. And I call the chapter The Web of Authority because I focus particularly on what I was talking about a little while ago, which was how important the teamwork of the parents, whoever they might be, is. Together, or by yourself if you're a single parent, as the parent, you create a habitat. And the idea of habitat came to me from many directions. There's a psychologist named Uri Bronfenbrenner, Russian, who taught at Cornell for many years, who developed the field of ecological psychology. And the idea there, we all know that we're social beings, but we also are living in a particular context, not just the context of the relationships of the family, but the context of the household. What are the routines? What are the expectations? Marion and I grew up with chores, although she's 7 years younger, so she grew up in rather a different habitat than I did, not only because we moved, but because major events like my mother's death gradually made the family a very different place. Another influence on me was Beatrice Whiting, who wrote a book called Children of Six Cultures, among others. And there was an article on the New York Times Parenting website recently about anthropology, and the writer was had a light bulb. Oh, not everyone does it the way we do. There's a lot of ways to raise a kid. There are a lot of environments that work well for children. Sometimes young children take care of even younger children. Sarah Hrdy wrote a book called Mothers and Others. She is an anthropologist and focused in that book on, actually just a couple of books. That one was more on anthropology. She has another one, I can't remember the name, that talks about motherhood across the whole biological world. And one of my favorite books that I've never known anyone else who came across, and I was going to hold it up, but I forgot to bring it into this room, is called The Natural History of Parenting. And it's by a woman named Susan Allport, who is a journalist who got interested, because she's also a sheep farmer, in parenting in the natural world. And I just love this book. I read it very early on, and it really kind of reinforced this idea that I had, that we really need to get back to the basics of being the big animal with a little animal. My own work, once I began to do research, was in language development, sibling interaction, wonder why, and the influence of context on relationships. One of the most wonderful writers in psychology, you might know, a man named Daniel Stern, is actually related to one of my New Lebanon neighbors and died not too long ago. And he wrote about, he's a psychiatrist who wrote about child development, particularly in infancy, and talked about what he called intersubjectivity and the dance between mother and child. And he was the first person who made me understand how much our bodies are interacting with each other. And there's wonderful videos of an adult interacting with a baby, and you can see what, and I'm swaying back and forth because that's what I remember from the video. So that chapter where I'm talking about interaction is called Being Together. Another chapter that talks about being together in a different way I called Moments of Authority. And this grew out of wonderful work from a group of anthropologists at UCLA at the Center for the Everyday Life of Families, who've written for decades about really using language in real life and how language both affects culture and is affected by it. So in Moments of Authority, I talk not only about sort of where you are when you speak, but the actual words that you use. My dissertation, once I got to that, was about parental beliefs about sibling conflict and whether their beliefs affected how they behaved with their kids. And when I was writing the book, I came back to that because I was surprised at how much I kept on coming to certain moments that had happened between me and my kids, or between my husband and my kids, but more me and my kids. And I'd say, why do I remember that? What did I learn in that moment? And that was what, sort of grappling with that, taught me that we have a set of values and beliefs, assumptions, guiding principles that we may not even be aware of until we're confronted with a situation that forces us to make a decision. You know, how much before dinner can you have a cookie? Should you take piano lessons? When can a child babysit? And parents have changed a lot on sort of the freedom that they allow kids. And that's, you know, those values I think are very personal, but they're also very culturally influenced. Finally, this idea of what happens between people got very visceral for me when I started in about 2006 or 7 listening to a podcast called Brain Science Podcast, which if you have a little time and you're interested, it's a mostly non-technical, sometimes it is, and she flags it, podcast in which the host, who's a pediatrician in Alabama, interviews the major writers and researchers in neuroscience. And I learned so much about the importance of our whole nervous system, and went to a lot of books that I wouldn't have gone to. And, you know, I'm not at all an expert. I'm really, it's kind of at a gut level. I was able to affirm some of what I already knew. Another book I read it's actually in, I don't even know what her field is called. I guess it's social psychology of a sort. It's called Emotional Contagion. And it's a way, you know, all these ways that we're communicating with each other that we don't even pay attention to, that we don't realize. And right now I'm looking at your faces and, you know, you're paying attention, and I'm getting something from you. And if I don't see any smiles for a while, then I say, okay, you know, maybe I need to tell a joke. But seriously, we are so influential on each other. And I don't think parents think about it enough. So that's the background. And now I'm going to read a little bit after I have a drink of water. And the first thing I'm going to read is actually from my epigram, because, you know, there are wonderful things that you find as you get old. I turned 70 last year, which is you may have had influences that you have no idea you had. So this quote doesn't have the phrase natural authority in it, but the book I got it from actually has the phrase natural authority. And I read this book, which is called The Lives of Children by George Dennison, in probably 1968 or 69. And maybe that stayed with me all these years. Oh, actually it does have it. The natural authority of adults and the needs of children are the great reservoir of the organic structuring that comes into being when arbitrary rules of order are dispensed with. The child is always finding himself, moving toward himself, as it were, in the near distance. The adult is his ally, his model, and his obstacle, for there are natural conflicts too, and they must be given their due. And he ended up founding a very small school, and I think he might have had one in California at one time, but the one I knew about was in New York, where the teaching was really based, it was very much relationship based. And what the child, it was a progressive school in the old sense of progressive, where the children were given a lot of freedom. But clearly he believed in sort of the presence and the authority of the adults and the adults organization. And then I had a quote from anthropology from Sarah Hurdy. Babies may be swaddled or wear diapers. They may be draped with amulets, dusted with talcum, basted with palm oil, or ceremoniously finger painted with protective symbols. But regardless of language or custom, the message conveyed by such ministrations is equivalent. You are cared for and will continue to be. Love, and that is a perfectly good word for what we are talking about here, is a message babies are all too eager to receive, and small wonder. So that's at the epigram. But then I begin the book with this anecdote. I stood in the sun at an outdoor festival watching two of my grandchildren play in a group of other kids with giant plastic blocks. As I watched, a woman in her 60s made the slightest flick of her finger toward the group, not even pausing in her conversation with a friend. A lively-looking boy of 5 or 6 who had just grabbed a block from another child made a slight scowl and gave the block back. Where did you learn to do that? I asked. I was a kindergarten teacher for 35 years, she answered. Being a teacher must have given her practice. Being in charge of 22 5-year-olds gave you little choice. But the child wasn't her student, and they were not in a classroom. This young boy, presumably her grandson, responded readily to her gesture because he knew exactly what the gesture meant. She was in charge, and she disapproved of what he had done. She didn't have to say a word. And I think you can imagine that this would be a less likely kind of interchange to see between a parent of today and a child on a playground. When I saw this exchange, I had already begun to write this book, and I found myself coming back repeatedly to a fundamental problem. Being a parent means setting limits and making demands on what can seem like a constant basis. But those demands may be met with a stamp of the foot, a scowl, an outburst, or an interaction that escalates into shouting or a slammed door. To the mothers and fathers I knew, the hardest part of being a parent was not mastering techniques, but sticking with them when their child protested or pushed back. So that was when I was already a grandmother. Flashback, let's see now, it's about 43 years, going on 44, when I was a mom in a playground with a 2-year-old, my first. It was time to leave the playground. I was 26, pregnant, and the stay-at-home mother of a 2-year-old. My husband and I just moved to a city that was hundreds of miles away from any family or friends. I knew no one else with a young child. My son was happily swinging, but it was time for lunch, and soon after that, the battleground of nap time. When I told him that it was time to leave, he said, "No, I don't want to go. I want to swing. I want to swing." After at least 2 more failed efforts at verbal persuasion, I lifted him off the swing. He cried and squirmed out of my arms and finally threw himself on the ground. He kicked and screamed in a full-fledged tantrum. I wanted to cry myself. Despite my experience with children as a big sister of 6 younger siblings, I was new to this relationship of parental authority that day at the playground. Not knowing what else to do, I carried my son, arms and legs flailing, the blessedly short half-block home. I was grateful that the playground was empty. How could it be that hard to get a 2-year-old home? I had obviously stayed at the playground too long, and now this tired and hungry little boy was incapable of pulling himself together. As much as I loved him, it was clear that in that moment, I didn't know how to help him. Still, I made a decision for his well-being and my young family's routine. I carried it out because I had a feeling of authority. I knew he needed lunch and a nap, and so did I. This was the moment in my own development, and I've literally gone back to this moment many times since, that I understood what being a parent meant, even more than struggles over sleep when he was an infant. No number of hugs or kisses would make him feel better. He was beyond words. Stressed and upset and alone as I felt, I knew that I had to be the grown-up in our relationship. I had to show him my love with firmness. We had to go home. And in my research for the book, I decided to go back to the Dr. Spock, the edition of Dr. Spock, which actually I had to find on online because I didn't still have it, because that was, along with Infants and Mothers, the only book I used. And believe it or not, there is a passage in Dr. Spock where he says, sometimes you have to pick up your child like a pig and carry him home. And I don't know if I read that before I carried my son home or after, but it was very affirmative. The last passage I'll read is actually from when I was the child, age 6. To celebrate my turning 6, my parents took me alone to see the newly reissued The Wizard of Oz. It was my first movie. 4 siblings, 2 older and 2 younger, were left at home. And I actually confirmed this with my older sister because I thought, maybe I imagined this. She said, oh no, you got to go. And I was jealous. And there's a slide of her from those days wearing a Dorothy costume. So clearly she was very into being Dorothy, and yet I was the one who got to go to the movie. But my parents did have a gift for finding their individual children and making them feel special. It was a big deal to be given this special attention, pulled out of the family system for a solo birthday outing. My other birthday present was a doll with a dog, which I had named Dorothy and Toto. I was in a heightened state of expectation and excitement, securely seated between my parents in the huge dark theater, unfazed by flying monkeys or the Wicked Witch of the West. But when the big hot air balloon worked loose and took off, without Dorothy, who was left bereft on the ground clutching Toto as the wizard flew away, I fell apart, triggered into a full-fledged meltdown, or what my mother described in her personal slang as an NB for nervous breakdown. I insisted that we leave the theater. I was so upset, angry, sad, betrayed that I took action. The minute we got home, I immediately renamed my doll Diane. The doll is long gone, but I remember the moment vividly. Any child is someone, a person who in the routine moments of family life, in a relationship with you, acts and interacts from her own developing sense of herself and the way the world works. And you, as someone too, consider who this child is, what it is like to be with her, and who you are in relation to her, filter through your experience in the world. But you can't know what it feels like from the inside for her. My behavior at the theater probably didn't surprise my parents, who surely would have described me as sensitive, but renaming my doll was a less predictable choice, something I came up with by myself. And the reason I chose these passages, and I've been using them for most of the book talks that I've given, is I like the idea that I was looking at this relationship at these 3 different moments. One as the grandmother, one as the young mother, and then one actually as the child. Because in the end, when people ask me what I got out of writing this book, I say that your child is a person. And I actually say this to couples who say, what's the main thing about couples therapy? And it's your partner is a person. We forget this too often about all of our relationships, that there's another person there with a body and an experience in the world, and they are experiencing us. So I will end there and welcome any questions about the book, about writing, about the pandemic, or anything else. Thanks for listening. And if you don't want to ask it, you can also put it in the chat box, but love to hear your questions or comments or experiences. I know at least a couple of you are grandmothers. Rochelle.
Hello.
Hi.
About your process, and you said your son sort of prompted you to start this project, and you spent 4 years before you kind of landed on the final theme of the book. I'm just curious, like that 4 years. Yeah, I'd just love to hear more about that search.
Yeah, it's not as if that's all I was doing, of course. I was becoming a grandmother. I was practicing psychology, living my life. But basically what I was doing was experimenting with writing about some of these moments, or the kinds of questions that that parents would present me with. And I don't know, it's the reason I went through what I did in the process is all these books that I mentioned, most of them weren't books that I read then. They were books that had influenced me 30 years before or more.
in the
So,
moment.
yeah, so
Parenting.
my original idea was actually to use just those sources. But of course, once I started to write, then one thing led to another. And as the book took shape, and what I did, I remember in January 2010, I said, okay, you've got to quit this messing around. You've got to start at the beginning and write. And I wrote an introduction, which I still really like as an essay. It didn't remain the introduction. It would actually sort of be fun to go back to it. But I'm not a linear person. I'm kind of all over the lot. But I needed to force myself to start at the beginning and see where it went. And that is how I came up with the themes of each chapter. And another thing about, I mean, I'm, just organic all the way. And I don't mean in what I eat, although mostly there too, which is I'm not someone who makes an outline except maybe after the fact. So I would write, and then I would sort of say, okay, so what did I just write? And it was mostly about 25 pages. And I could usually, I had to move pieces around like I do with my puzzle or my quilts, but there was an essence to each of these essays that I came up with. So that's sort of the best I can do. It's a long time ago now, and because I did come to the theme and the shape of the book, it's a little hard to remember when I was grappling. But this authority was always the theme because I would talk about structure, and I would talk about routine, and I would talk about limits, and I would talk about chores, and I would talk about the family environment. But I would also talk about, actually, I think I didn't talk that much about the connection and the trust part. And so I think that that's good to think about. As I actually wrote the book, I realized that what I meant by natural authority wasn't just discipline and limits. There was a whole other side to it, which is why does a child do what you ask him or her to do? Because they trust you, because they have a relationship with you. Now, some children do what they're told because they're scared of what's going to happen if they don't. And there's the lack of trust. But the kind of more harmonious sort of setting of limits and expectations, and even sometimes when it's hard, I think comes more from connection and trust. And I would say that came later. Because I think I was more on these parents don't know what to do. They've got to set the limits. And then I gradually.
Would you say being a grandmother helped inform that kind of?
Well, it's interesting you ask, because one of the chapters has a section in it which is based on something that happened when my oldest granddaughter, who's now almost 16, was 3. And that was trying to get her out of the house for a walk. And the sort of wheedling, cajoling, and had to choose between which tights and which shoes and which jacket. And I was losing my cool, sort of like, come on already. And I realized looking back that at a certain point, I did get very annoyed. And my voice changed. And I gave her a choice. Either we're, your dad's jacket or your jacket, or we're not going. And she chose her jacket, and we got in the wagon and we went. And then she fell asleep. Well, the whole reason she was grumpy was probably because she was tired, and it wasn't really a good time to take a walk. And that maybe took being a grandmother to recognize.
I have to go. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here. Nice to see you. And I like that laugh just then.
Oh.
Anyone else? Are you thinking of writing something, Rochelle? Is that what made you interested?
Yeah, actually, I started a blog during this pandemic, and so process is very much on my mind. And I was just curious, how you sort of found your way to your theme.
Well, I think that you do have to just show up with the blank screen or the blank piece of paper, and I did get very disciplined about the writing.
That's great.
And enjoyed it. And I had, if I had them here, I'd show you. In addition to my computer documents, I have 25 moleskin notebooks that are about this big, in which I would, when I was having trouble writing on the computer, I'd write in the notebook, or I'd take notes from one of my sources, or I'd try to outline what the heck I thought I was saying. Sometimes I would write more of a journal entry, like, what am I doing here? Or something else would be on my mind. So that was a very important part of my process, the sort of going back and forth between the notebooks and the computer.
Adelia, listening
Yeah.
to you, I think on the one hand of the time that we grew up, I'm the same age more or less as you, when parents did exert a certain authority. My wife, Dessa, has a book by her childhood doctor called Be Firm But Nice, or Be Nice But
There you
Firm.
go,
I'm
love
not
and
sure
limits.
which it is. But now we've entered an era of, I'm no expert in this field, of parents kind of, anything that their kid wants is okay. Anything they want fit, like an object, is okay. Anything they want to do is okay. And at the same time, we have this image of helicopter parents. What, in a broad sense, not with reference to anybody's particular kids, do you see as the effect of this, if it is accurate, development in how parents function?
Well, this is not really so much my area, but there's a lot out there, a lot of psychologists. There's a whole book by the admissions director at Stanford University about how this phenomenon has sort of deprived kids of their agency. And I mean, on the one hand, they have the agency of, permissiveness and indulgence, but on the other hand, but watch out because I don't really trust you to do it by yourself. I'm going to hover over you. There's a wonderful book from someone in Berkeley, Diane Ehrensaft, who wrote the foreword for my book called Spoiling Childhood. And I can't remember the subtitle, something like, why we give our children what they want and not too much of what they want and not enough of what they need. And I think the consensus among professionals is parents really need to let kids fail and let kids stumble. And there's some books, even The Gift of Failure is one very popular book on this topic. And I can't remember her name. She's also from California. One of the wonderful things that seemed to be coming out of the pandemic is parents who are confronted with 24/7 childcare, education, and their own work are finding that, in fact, their kids can do a lot more by themselves than parents thought. They can entertain themselves. They can be bored and find something to do. But I think it's been an adjustment for some families. So I would say my own work came more out of the distress of parents that I was seeing who wanted to make things happen, whether it was mealtime, bedtime, or homework, and didn't feel they could make it happen. And what you're talking about is sort of a whole culture of parents feeling somewhat helpless. And I'm sure there's a lot of ink spilled on why. I'm not even quite sure, but some people blame Dr. Spock, but in fact, Dr. Spock believed in limits. He was pretty firm.
Well, we had an example of that this week. Our son, who is 28 years old this week and lives in France, he had to decide whether to come home to the United States as he had been planning to do, or to stay in France. And each choice had its issues. And I said something like, well, we'll decide. And he said, I'll decide. And,
Go, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
Well, I found out at some point in studying all this stuff that the brain matures around 25.
Mm.
And I had realized as each of my kids got to 25, I think when the second one got to 25, I said, wait, this, something has changed here. They're not really under my umbrella anymore. There was a feeling that I had, that even if I was helping them out in one way or another, they really had become who they, some core of who they were going to be. And so I'm not surprised that Jeffrey would be impatient with your idea that you were going to make that decision. And I can also understand why you wanted to be part of it. And I see that Julie's put in the column, The Gift of Failure by Jessica Leahy. Anyone else? I know, Wendy, you've become a grandmother lately.
I did. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to say, well, being a grandmother is so amazing. I can't believe how wonderful it is not only to have this new person in the world, but to see my son and his wife become parents. It's
Yeah.
this is such a beautiful process to watch. But I just wanted to comment what a treat it is to hear you talk about becoming an author, your long desire to become an author, and then the path that you took, and the fact that the subtitle of your book is Natural Authority? Is that
Love
right?
Limits and the Natural Authority of Parenthood. Yeah.
Natural authority, and that the root of the word authority is author.
That's true. That's
And this
true.
is such a wonderful, and it just struck me as you were talking about it, how you were walking that path through your life. And here is a child you've given birth to, finally.
Yeah, well, thank you. And for those who don't know, Wendy runs the Chatham bookstore, so she knows wherever she speaks. Yeah, and actually, I have quite a lot of writing from over the years that I've done. And I mean, I have some regrets that I didn't start sooner, that I didn't feel more confident, that I didn't look for the kind of help I needed to make it happen. But I didn't. And, as you get older, you just finally have to accept, well, here you are. And then I did it. What's interesting, and Rochelle, in relation to what you were asking, despite the fact that I had to come to the shape of this book over a period of several years, when I look back at some of the things I wrote as a young mother, and even there was a letter or a journal entry around the time my mother was dying, and I was writing in relation to my father, a lot of this same personality and belief in the role of a parent was evident. And I have friends in Pittsburgh who knew me when I was, first had young children, and said, you were always talking about, you got to be the parent, you got to have authority. So, I guess I was an author in both those senses all along, but I really appreciate your saying that. It's still surprising to me when people introduce me, psychologist and writer, because, I am, but I don't quite embrace it as part of my identity. I think it's about time, though. And that was why I wanted to have this talk be more about that, as well as the ideas.
Thank you.
As your sister, sharing the same parents, I haven't even talked to you about how much were they present as you were, well, obviously they were present for your journey as a parent, but then in the writing of the book, how much did you reflect on?
I don't think I did that much. I think I reflected more on my own experience as a parent, but I do know that my experience as a parent definitely was shaped by the experience of being their child. And I think habitat might be the strongest aspect of it, because we had a pretty organized household when I was, young, and we had a lot of freedom the way kids my age, in our era did, but there were expectations of mealtime and chores and even resolving conflicts. I think when I think about them now, I don't think there were that many times when they had to actually assert authority with me. Someone actually asked me the other day, I was actually my daughter-in-law, on Mother's Day, they did a little interview about my childhood, and she said, what was the naughtiest thing you did or the worst thing you did, and I thought, I was a pretty good kid. As I got older, sort of into my teen and college years, there were some definite adventures. But as a kid, I think I had a good place in the family, and I think because I did enjoy kids so much, and I did enjoy making things, which is a great thing to do with kids, and that's still the main thing I do. Read stories and make things. That's one of my granddaughters said. That's what you do. It was such a natural fit that I think I was able to manage without having to be confronted with authority. I'll think more about that and we'll talk about it, but that's an interesting question because I think the answer ultimately is the whole gestalt more than them as people. And I think, that I was sort of surprised that I came up with a Wizard of Oz anecdote. I mean, that's a very vivid memory for me. Was it just because the movie was scary? I don't think so. I think it was the whole thing. And by the way, the movie theater we went to was in Kent, Connecticut, which those of you who are in New Lebanon or Chatham, is not far away. It was a journey in a car and, going to town from the country. Well, I'm happy to keep answering questions. We're also going on an hour, so that seems to be the arc that a lot of these sessions take.
Yeah. Do you want to put the information on how to get the book into the chat?
I put it at the top of the chat when we started.
So
Let's
if
see
you
if it's
scroll
still
up,
there.
you'll be able to find it.
Oh, okay. All right. So basically, let's see. If I put it here, will it go to everyone? No. How do I do to everyone? Wait. To everyone. Okay. So my website is adeliamoore.com and my email's there, but my email is adeliamoore@gmail.com. And I guess, with independent bookstores closed, I guess some of them may still be taking orders by phone. I don't know, or online. I don't know. When is that true of the Chatham bookstore?
Yeah, by email.
By email. Okay, so independent bookstores, and which is always my favorite. But as I was telling Julie, because I thought I was giving several talks this spring, I have a couple of cartons of books in my possession. And so if someone emails me, I would be happy to send you a copy. And email me. Oops. I'll say and online, but we don't want to encourage those online giants. Okay. And Chatham Library will ultimately have a copy of it when the library is open. Thank you so much, everybody, for your
Thank you so much. It's fantastic.
Thank you, Adelia.
Thank you, Adelia. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You just say goodbye.